Imagine you are standing on a humid street corner in Bangkok during the summer of 1997. The air is thick, but it is not just the tropical heat. There is a palpable sense of panic rising from the pavement. You see people lining up outside banks with desperate looks on their faces. News tickers are flashing red across every television screen in the city. The Thai baht, a currency that felt like a rock for years, is suddenly in a freefall. It is losing value so fast that shopkeepers can barely update their prices. This moment was the first crack in an old world order. Here is a shocking fact for your morning coffee. Since that day in Bangkok, Asia has grown to represent over 50% of all global economic growth. You probably still think of the United States or Europe as the undisputed engines of the planet. But the reality is that the steering wheel of the global economy has been moving east for decades. It is not just coming soon. It is already here. How did a region that was essentially broke 30 years ago become the most powerful financial force on Earth? To understand where we are going, we have to look at that 1997 collapse. It was called the Asian Financial Crisis, or the Tom Yum Goong Crisis. It started with a speculative attack on the Thai currency. Foreign investors got spooked and started pulling their money out as fast as they could. The fire spread to Indonesia, South Korea, and Malaysia. It felt like the entire region was going up in flames. The International Monetary Fund stepped in with massive bailouts, but the conditions were brutal. They demanded deep cuts to government spending and massive interest rate hikes. People in Seoul were so moved by the crisis that they literally donated their wedding rings and family heirlooms to the government to help pay off the national debt. There are photos from that time of giant piles of gold jewelry being melted down to save the country. That collective trauma changed everything. It created a never-again mentality across the entire continent. Asian leaders realized they could never again depend on the kindness of Western institutions. They decided to build their own fortresses of cash. They started exporting everything they could to build up massive reserves of US dollars. This leads us to one of the most significant moments in modern history. In late 2001, a group of officials met in Doha, Qatar. They signed a document that allowed China to join the World Trade Organization. At the time, it felt like a win for globalism. Western companies were excited about 1 billion new customers. But looking back, it was like opening a floodgate that could never be closed. Suddenly, the factory of the world was open for business. The sheer scale of what happened next is hard to wrap your head around. Imagine a city the size of Chicago being built from scratch almost every year. That was the pace of urbanization in China. Millions of people moved from rural farms to coastal factory towns. They were making shoes, toys, and eventually the very smartphone you might be holding right now. Finance people still go back and forth on whether the China shock was an unavoidable tragedy for Western labor or an inevitable step in global evolution. Some argue that the world gained hundreds of millions of middle-class consumers. Others point to the hollowed-out manufacturing towns in the American Midwest as the hidden cost of this shift. Regardless of who is right, the momentum was unstoppable. While China was capturing the headlines, South Korea was quietly executing a different kind of miracle. They call it the miracle on the Han River. In the 1960s, South Korea's GDP per capita was lower than that of many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. By the early 2000s, they were leading the world in high-speed internet and flat-screen televisions. They did not just want to assemble parts for other people, they wanted to own the brands. Think about the brands you see every day: Samsung, LG, and Hyundai. These were once considered budget options. Now, they are the gold standard in many industries. You watch this transformation and realize it was not an accident. It was a calculated, decades-long sprint. This success became a blueprint for the neighbors. Countries like Vietnam and Thailand looked at Korea and China and saw a path out of poverty. They realized that manufacturing was the ladder. You start with clothes and textiles, then you move to electronics assembly. Eventually, you start designing the chips. The numbers involved in this shift are staggering. We are talking about a $50 trillion swing in purchasing power. To visualize that, imagine enough cash to fill every professional football stadium in the world several times over. That is the amount of wealth that has migrated toward Asia since the turn of the millennium. In the early days of this transition, the West mostly saw Asia as a source of cheap labor. It was a place where things were made, not invented. There was a certain amount of smugness in boardrooms in London and New York. The thinking was that the East would do the heavy lifting, while the West would keep the high-level intellectual property and the profits. But that dynamic started to flip faster than anyone expected. In the mid-2000s, the world saw a massive surge in patent filings coming out of East Asia. They were not just copying anymore. They were iterating and improving. They were building better supply chains and more efficient ports. You notice this when you look at the infrastructure. If you fly into a major Asian hub today, the airports feel like they belong in a sci-fi movie. The trains move at 200 miles per hour and arrive exactly on time. Meanwhile, many Western hubs feel like they are frozen in the 1970s. This physical reality is a reflection of where the investment capital is flowing. The 2008 global financial crisis was another turning point. While the US and Europe were reeling from the subprime mortgage collapse, Asia stayed relatively stable. They had learned their lesson in 1997. They had the cash reserves. They had the high savings rates. When the Western consumer stopped spending, China launched a 4 trillion yuan stimulus package to keep its own economy humming. That was the moment the world realized Asia could grow, even when the West was struggling. It was the birth of a decoupled growth story. The region stopped being just a satellite of the American consumer. It started to become its own sun with its own gravity. Now, look at the geopolitical chessboard. For a long time, the US dollar was the only game in town. Every oil contract and every shipping deal was settled in greenbacks. But recently, we have seen a push to change that. There are more and more deals being settled in local currencies. It is a slow, quiet revolution, but the implications are massive. The shift of $50 trillion is not just about money in bank accounts. It is about who gets to decide how the world works. It is about whose standards win in technology, whose environmental rules we follow, and which languages people learn in school. We are living through the most significant rebalancing of power since the Industrial Revolution. It is a story of resilience, massive bets, and a relentless focus on the future. The era of Western dominance is not ending because of a single war or a sudden crash. It is ending because the East simply outpaced everyone else while the rest of the world was looking the other way. The world used to have a very simple view of Asian manufacturing. For decades, the region was essentially the world's basement workshop. It was the place where you sent a blueprint and a pile of cash to get 1 million cheap plastic toys back. But that old story has a massive hole in it now. The factory floor has evolved into a high-tech laboratory. Asia is no longer just putting the pieces together for Western brands. They are owning the designs, the patents, and the very machines that make the modern world run. This shift started with a group of countries often called the Tiger Cubs. You might think of Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam as vacation spots, but in the world of finance, they are the new engines of production. As labor costs in China began to rise, these nations stepped up to the plate. They did not just want the low-end textile jobs, they went straight for the high-value electronics. Look at Vietnam as a prime example. 10 years ago, the country was mostly known for agricultural exports and apparel. Today, it is a global powerhouse for smartphone production. In a sprawling industrial park outside of Hanoi, the sheer scale of the change hits you. Imagine a facility so large it has its own zip code and housing for tens of thousands of workers. Inside these clean rooms, workers in white suits handle components so delicate that a single speck of dust could ruin them. This is not the cheap labor story of the 1990s. This is high-precision engineering on a massive scale. One of the most notable shifts happened when Samsung decided to move a huge chunk of its production to Vietnam. It was a multi-billion-dollar bet that transformed the entire local economy. Suddenly, a whole ecosystem of suppliers popped up around these factories. Local companies started learning how to meet global standards for quality and speed. This created a ripple effect. When one giant moves, the rest of the industry watches. Soon, other tech giants began eyeing the region as a China plus one strategy. They wanted to keep their big operations in China but needed a backup plan to avoid putting all their eggs in one basket. Analysts still argue about whether these tiger cub economies can truly replicate the massive success of their neighbors. Some skeptics think the window for manufacturing-led growth is closing due to automation. Others point to the young, tech-savvy populations in Southeast Asia as a source of endless energy. The tension is real because the stakes are so high. If these nations can climb the value chain, they will cement Asia's grip on the global supply chain for another century. Then there is the silicon shield. This is perhaps the most critical piece of the $50 trillion puzzle. Most people know that semiconductors are in everything from cars to toasters, but many do not realize just how much of that production happens on a single island. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, has become the most important company you might never think about. They do not just make chips. They make the best chips. The tech inside a TSMC fab is so advanced it feels like magic. We are talking about etched circuits that are measured in nanometers. For perspective, a human hair is about 80,000 to 100,000 nanometers wide. TSMC is working with 3 nanometers. This level of precision requires machines that cost hundreds of millions of dollars each. It is a barrier to entry so high that almost no one else can clear it. This creates a fascinating dynamic. The entire global economy, including the US and China, is deeply dependent on this one company. This dependency creates a unique kind of drama. If those factories ever stopped humming, the global economy would essentially grind to a halt. It would not just be about missing the newest phone, it would mean no new medical devices, no new cars, and no new data centers. This silicon shield theory suggests that the world cannot afford a conflict in the region because the economic cost would be total. It is a high-stakes game of chicken where the prize is the future of computing. But you cannot have a world-class factory without a way to move the goods. This is where the infrastructure piece comes in. You look at the map of Asia today and see a web of new rails, ports, and bridges. This is often tied to the Belt and Road Initiative. It is a massive project designed to connect Asia with Europe and Africa by land and sea. Imagine a freight train leaving a dusty terminal in western China. It travels through the mountains of Central Asia, crosses the plains of Russia, and ends up in a terminal in Germany. It is the modern Silk Road, and it is changing the geography of trade. Picture a massive dry port in the middle of a desert in Kazakhstan. 10 years ago, there was nothing there but sand and wind. Today, it is a buzzing hub of giant cranes and thousands of shipping containers. It is a literal bridge between east and west. This physical connectivity allows goods to move faster than a ship and cheaper than a plane. It creates new economic corridors in places the world had forgotten for centuries. However, building all this stuff is not without friction. There is a lot of debate about the debt involved in these massive projects. Some countries have struggled to pay back the loans used to build these ports and railways. This has led to accusations of debt-trap diplomacy. It is a messy, complicated reality. On one hand, these countries desperately need the infrastructure to grow. On the other hand, the financial terms can be crushing if the growth doesn't happen fast enough. You notice the tension when you read the headlines about port ownership or high-speed rail contracts. It is not just about moving boxes. It is about who owns the gate. In places like Sri Lanka or Pakistan, the ownership of a strategic port can shift the balance of power in the entire Indian Ocean. This is where finance and geopolitics become inseparable. Every bridge and every pier is a chess piece in a much larger game. Even the way these factories are powered is shifting. Asia is currently the world leader in renewable energy investment. They are building solar farms the size of small cities. They are the world's biggest producers of EV batteries. This is another layer of the factory story. They are not just making the cars of the future. They are making the power sources that will run them. You realize that the made-in label is becoming less important than the owned-by label. Asian companies are buying up Western brands and integrating them into their superior supply chains. They are taking the expertise they gained as low-end manufacturers and using it to dominate the entire life cycle of a product. From the raw minerals in the ground to the final software update, the fingerprints of the East are everywhere. This section of the journey shows us that the $50 trillion shift is built on a foundation of concrete, steel, and silicon. It is the result of millions of small decisions made by factory managers, port authorities, and government planners. They decided to stop being the world's assistants and start being the bosses. The factory floor isn't a place of drudgery anymore. It's the front line of a global revolution. While the giant factories were humming along, something even more powerful was brewing in the background. It wasn't about what these countries were making for others. It was about what they were starting to buy for themselves. 1 billion people were moving from basic survival into the global middle class. This is the largest expansion of human wealth in history. It is a transformation that changed the very DNA of global commerce. Imagine walking through a bustling night market in Jakarta or a high-end shopping district in Shanghai. The first thing that hits you is the sound of silence. Not because it is quiet, but because the old, sputtering motorbikes have been replaced by a fleet of electric scooters. The second thing you notice is what is in everyone's hand. It is not a wallet, it is a smartphone, and it is the center of their entire universe. In the West, we have separate apps for everything. We have one for chatting, one for ride-sharing, another for food delivery, and yet another for banking. In Asia, they decided that was too much work. They pioneered the super app. Think of platforms like WeChat, Alipay, or Grab. These are not just apps, they are digital operating systems for life. You watch someone at a tiny street food stall. They scan a QR code taped to a piece of cardboard, and the transaction is done in a millisecond. No cash, no plastic cards, no fuss. This digital leapfrog is one of the most verifiable shifts in the region's power. While the West was busy trying to make credit cards more secure, Asia simply skipped over them. They went straight from cash to high-frequency digital payments. This created a massive mountain of data. Every bowl of noodles purchased and every ride home tells a story about consumer behavior. This data allowed these companies to offer loans, insurance, and investment products to people who had never even stepped foot inside a traditional bank. It unlocked a level of financial participation that was previously impossible. There is a real disagreement among economists on whether this rapid digitization is a shortcut to permanent wealth or a bubble waiting to burst. Some worry that the ease of digital credit could lead to a household debt crisis. Others argue that the efficiency gains are so large that they fundamentally change the math of economic growth. Regardless of the debate, the momentum is undeniable. Then we have the story of India. For a long time, the world expected India to follow the China model. Everyone thought they would build massive factories and export their way to the top. But India chose a different path. They decided to leapfrog directly into the service sector. They became the world's back office, but they didn't stop there. India built something called the India Stack. It is a massive, government-backed digital infrastructure that gives every citizen a unique biometric ID. This allowed the country to bring hundreds of millions of people into the formal economy almost overnight. In cities like Bengaluru or Hyderabad, the energy is electric. You see gleaming glass towers where thousands of engineers are not just coding for Western firms, but building the next generation of global startups. India's massive service sector leapfrog has created a unique kind of middle class. It is a workforce that is young, English-speaking, and incredibly hungry for success. This demographic dividend is a huge tailwind. While the rest of the world is aging, India is just getting started. This brings a different kind of pressure. The government has to create millions of jobs every year just to keep up with the graduates entering the market. This explosion of consumers has forced a total pivot in the world of luxury. For a long time, brands like Louis Vuitton, Gucci, and Apple looked at Asia as a nice extra market. Now, it is the main event. In many ways, these brands now live or die based on their performance in Asian shopping malls. Picture a luxury flagship store in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. In Paris or New York, it might be quiet. In Chengdu or Mumbai, there is a line out the door. These consumers aren't just buying a bag. They are buying a status symbol that marks their entry into the global elite. This has given Asian consumers an incredible amount of leverage. They can demand products that are tailored specifically to their tastes and traditions. We saw this dynamic play out during the recent Lunar New Year celebrations. Every major global brand released limited edition products to cater to the holiday. They are no longer just selling a Western lifestyle to the East. They are trying to prove that they understand and respect Eastern culture. It is a complete reversal of the old colonial-style marketing. But there is a twist in this story. As these consumers get wealthier, they are starting to look closer to home. We are seeing the rise of Sea Beauty in China and homegrown tech brands across Southeast Asia. These local companies are often faster, cheaper, and better at understanding what the local person actually wants. A few years ago, Western beauty brands dominated the shelves. Today, local brands are using social media and key opinion leaders to take over the market. They are moving at the speed of the internet. A local brand can see a trend in the morning and have a product ready for sale by the end of the week. The old, slow Western giants are struggling to keep up. The $50 trillion shift is not just about the money being made in factories. It is about the money being spent in the streets. It is about the emergence of a consumer base that is more tech-savvy and more demanding than any the world has ever seen. This group is no longer looking to the West for inspiration. They are setting the trends themselves. The consequences of this shift are everywhere. When a major movie studio decides which films to greenlight, they aren't just thinking about the American box office. They are looking at the theater counts in India and China. When a car company designs a new interior, they are prioritizing the features that appeal to a driver in Jakarta. The world is being reshaped to fit the desires of this new middle class. This isn't a future scenario. It is the current reality of 2026. The economic center of gravity has landed squarely in the East because that is where the most people are making the most money. It is a world where a teenager in Manila has more in common with a teenager in Seoul than they do with someone in London. They are part of a shared digital culture that is redefining what it means to be a global citizen. The middle class explosion is the engine that keeps the $50 trillion shift moving. It provides the demand that fuels the factories and the capital that funds the next generation of tech. It is a self-sustaining cycle of growth that has finally reached its full speed. The era of the Western consumer being the only one who matters is officially over. Now, the rest of the world is just trying to catch up to the new standard. Every great success story eventually hits a wall. For decades, the narrative in Asia was nothing but up, up, and up. But as we sit here in 2026, the cracks are starting to show in some very predictable places. It turns out that getting rich is the easy part. Staying rich and keeping that momentum going while your population ages and your neighbors get jealous is a whole different ballgame. The region is currently facing a set of obstacles that could either solidify its dominance or slow it down to a crawl. The first big hurdle is something economists call the middle income trap. Imagine a country that has done everything right. They built the factories, they exported the goods, they moved millions of people into cities. But then, the wages started to go up. Suddenly, they are not the cheap option anymore. But they are also not quite ready to compete with the high-end innovation of Germany or the Silicon Valley. They are stuck in the middle. You see this tension playing out right now in countries like Thailand and Malaysia. They have been the world's workshop for years, but the next step is hard. To move up, you need a world-class education system and a massive amount of research and development. You need to stop making the parts and start making the software. This transition is incredibly painful. It requires a total overhaul of the economy, and not every government is up to the task. Analysts still argue about whether the middle income trap is a law of nature or just a failure of policy. Some believe that countries like Vietnam will sail right through it because of their tech-savvy youth. Others point to the historical record, which shows that very few nations have ever successfully made the jump from middle to high income. This debate is not just academic. It determines where trillions of dollars in investment will flow over the next decade. Then there is the demographic reality. It is a quiet, slow-moving crisis that is starting to scream. For years, Asia's secret sauce was a seemingly endless supply of young, motivated workers. But that supply is drying up. Japan was the first to hit this wall. Today, there are parts of rural Japan where you can find ghost houses for sale for a few $100s because there's simply no one left to live in them. Picture a modern factory in the outskirts of Tokyo. You might expect to see thousands of young people on the assembly line. Instead, you see a sea of highly advanced robots supervised by a handful of engineers in their 60s. They are using technology to fill the gap left by a missing generation. It is a fascinating and somewhat eerie glimpse into the future. Japan is essentially a massive social experiment in how to run a wealthy society with more retired people than workers. The real drama starts when you realize that China is now following the same path, but much faster. The working age population in China peaked years ago and is now in a steady decline. There is a very real fear that the country might get old before it gets rich. This creates a massive strain on the social safety net. Who pays for the healthcare and pensions of hundreds of millions of elderly citizens when the workforce is shrinking? This isn't a problem for the distant future. It is a problem that is being debated in every government meeting right now. This leads us to the current friction at the top of the global food chain. The rise of Asia has triggered a massive geopolitical tug-of-war. For a long time, the West was happy to trade with the East because the roles were clear. But as Asian companies started leading in areas like 5G, artificial intelligence, and electric vehicles, the mood changed. It shifted from cooperation to competition. Imagine an executive boardroom in a major Western tech firm. The conversation isn't just about profit margins anymore. It is about national security and supply chain resilience. You notice the language shifting in the annual reports. They are no longer talking about outsourcing. They are talking about de-risking and friendshoring. This is the China Plus One strategy in action. The idea is simple, but incredibly expensive. Companies are keeping their big operations in China because they have to, but they are building their next big factory somewhere else, like India, Vietnam, or Mexico. They want a backup plan in case the trade wars get even worse. This has led to a frantic scramble for talent and resources in Southeast Asia. Consider a recent news segment where a major smartphone manufacturer announced a massive shift in its production lines. They weren't moving because of labor costs. They were moving because of political pressure and the fear of new sanctions. This tech war is creating a fragmented world. We are seeing the rise of two different digital ecosystems. One is led by the US and the other by China. This friction makes everything more expensive and more complicated for everyone. There is also the tension of the silicon shield we talked about earlier. As the US and China compete for dominance in semiconductors, Taiwan is caught in the middle. The pressure is immense. Every time a new export restriction is announced in Washington, the ripples are felt in every electronics market in the world. It is a high-stakes game where one wrong move could trigger a global recession. Finance people still go back and forth on whether this friction will lead to a hard landing for the global economy. Some believe the world is too interconnected to truly fall apart. They argue that the sheer amount of money at stake will force everyone to play nice eventually. Others are more pessimistic. They see the rising trade barriers and the buy local movements as signs that the era of hyperglobalization is over. You watch these shifts and realize that the $50 trillion story is entering a new, more volatile phase. The low-hanging fruit of cheap labor and easy exports has been picked. Now, the region has to deal with the consequences of its own success. It has to figure out how to innovate while its workforce shrinks and how to navigate a world that is increasingly suspicious of its power. In the middle of all this, India is trying to position itself as the third way. They are pitching themselves as a democratic, English-speaking alternative to the China-centric supply chain. It is a compelling pitch, but it comes with its own set of problems. India's infrastructure still lags behind, and its bureaucracy can be a nightmare to navigate. The race is on to see if India can fix its internal issues fast enough to catch the wave of companies looking for a new home. The friction at the top is not just about big numbers on a chart. It is about the daily lives of billions of people. It is about whether a young graduate in Bangkok can find a high-paying job. It is about whether a retiree in Shanghai will have a dignified old age. It is about whether the world stays open for business or retreats into a series of walled gardens. As we move toward the final chapters of this $50 trillion shift, the stakes couldn't be higher. The Asian century is still on track, but the road is getting much bumpier. The optimism of the early 2000s has been replaced by a gritty, calculated realism. The region is no longer just rising. It is fighting to stay at the top. The outcome of this struggle will define the global economy for the rest of our lives. Here's the thing about power. It doesn't just come from having the most money or the biggest factories. It comes from the ability to set the global rules of the game. For over a century, those rules were written in English and signed in Western capitals. But as we move deeper into 2026, Asia is finally picking up the pen. We are seeing a transition from a region that simply follows global trends to one that defines them. This is the final stage of the $50 trillion shift. Think about the way trade actually works on the ground. In the past, if a company in Malaysia wanted to sell components to a factory in Japan, they had to navigate a mountain of confusing paperwork. Every country had its own specific standards, its own tariffs, and its own special deals. It was a logistical nightmare that often required a Western bank to mediate. Then came the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. It sounds like a boring piece of government bureaucracy, but in reality it is a massive earthquake in the world of commerce. Picture a busy customs official at a bustling port in Ho Chi Minh City. In the old days, they would be checking dozens of different forms for a single shipment of high-tech sensors. Now, they are using a unified system that covers nearly a third of the entire planet's economy. This trade bloc is bigger than the European Union. It is bigger than the trade agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada. It represents a world where Asia is finally talking to Asia without needing a middleman. This is a verifiable event that has fundamentally changed how money moves. Because the rules are now streamlined, companies within the region are trading with each other more than ever before. They are creating their own internal supply chains that are shorter and more efficient. This makes the region incredibly resilient to shocks from the outside world. If the West goes into a recession, the East now has enough internal demand to keep its own lights on. Now, look at the transition to green energy. This is where the new global architecture is truly being built. You might think of the Green Revolution as a Western ideal, driven by policies in Europe or the US. But the hardware of that revolution is almost entirely Asian. If you want to build an electric vehicle today, you are essentially buying an Asian product, no matter what logo is on the hood. Imagine a giant, high-tech laboratory in the city of Ningde. Inside, scientists are working in environments that are cleaner than a hospital operating room. They are developing the next generation of solid-state batteries. These are the engines of the 21st century. Companies like CATL and BYD have achieved a level of dominance that makes the old oil giants look small. They don't just make the batteries, they control the mines in Indonesia for nickel and the processing plants in China for lithium. This isn't just about manufacturing, it is about innovation. We have moved past the era where Asian companies were just copying Western designs. Today, the world is copying them. There's still a real disagreement on whether the West can ever catch up in the battery race. Some analysts believe that billions in government subsidies can build a domestic supply chain in the US and Europe. Others argue that Asia's lead in battery chemistry and manufacturing scale is now so large that it is essentially unassailable. You notice this shift when you look at how people spend their time and money. It is not just about physical goods anymore. It is about cultural influence. For a long time, the global dream was defined by Hollywood movies and American music. But today, the most popular video games, the most influential social media platforms, and the biggest pop stars are often coming out of Seoul, Beijing, or Tokyo. Think about the global impact of a game like Black Myth, Wukong, or the total dominance of TikTok's algorithm. These are not just products. They are digital exports that shape how billions of people think and behave. They are the new soft power. When a teenager in Brazil or a student in France spends their day on an app designed in Singapore or Beijing, the cultural center of gravity has moved. This innovation is also happening in the world of finance. We are seeing the rise of central bank digital currencies across the region. While the rest of the world is still debating the pros and cons, countries like Thailand and China are already running massive trials. They are building a world where international payments happen instantly, without the need for the old, slow, SWIFT system. It is a direct challenge to the financial architecture that has existed since World War II. Even the way cities are built is changing. The new smart cities in the East are acting as living laboratories for the rest of the world. They are testing everything from autonomous delivery drones to AI-managed power grids. When a city in the Middle East or Africa wants to modernize, they aren't looking at New York or London for inspiration. They are looking at the efficiency of Singapore or the high-tech infrastructure of Shenzhen. The $50 trillion shift is the result of a massive, coordinated effort to build a new world. It started with cheap labor, moved to high-tech manufacturing, and has now arrived at global leadership. It is a story of a region that refused to stay in the basement and decided to own the entire building. The rules of the next century are being written right now, and for the first time in history, they are being written in the East. The reality of 2026 is that we are no longer waiting for the Asian century to arrive. We are already living in it. The shift in power is not a theory. It is a physical reality that you see in the ports, the labs, and the digital world. It is a world that is more connected, more tech-driven, and more Eastern than anyone could have imagined 30 years ago. As the sun sets on the old era of Western dominance, the view from the East looks incredibly bright. The momentum is there. The capital is there. Most importantly, the ambition is there. The transition is complete, and the new global architect has taken its seat at the head of the table. It is a lot to take in when you realize how quickly the world can change. We often think of history as something that happens slowly, but as we've seen, a $50 trillion shift can happen in the span of a single generation. It makes you wonder what the next 30 years will look like as these new powers continue to grow and evolve. I would love to hear from all of you on this. Where are you watching this from today? Whether you are in a quiet town in the Midwest or a bustling high-rise in Manila, you are likely feeling the ripples of this economic change in your daily life. How is the current economic situation looking in your corner of the world? Are you seeing more local innovation, or are you feeling the pressure of global competition? Do you have any big plans for the coming year to navigate these shifts? Maybe you are learning a new skill, looking into different markets, or just trying to stay ahead of the curve. Whatever your strategy is, I'd love to read about it in the comments. Hearing your personal stories helps make these massive global numbers feel a lot more real. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the changing world order, please consider hitting that like button. It really helps the channel out and lets me know that you want to see more stories like this one. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We have a lot more stories coming up about the hidden forces shaping our world, and I don't want you to miss the next video. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I'll see you in the next one.